This is Chapter 5, Part 3, The Rape of the Mind, by Just A.M. Merleau, M.D. Not content with this strategic attack on the will to defend oneself, Hitler tried to paralyze Europe with the threat of terror, not only the threat of bombing, destruction, and occupation, but also the psychological threat implicit in his own boast of ruthlessness. The fear of an implacable foe makes man more willing to submit even before he has begun to fight. Hitler's criminal acts at home, the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the mass murders, the atmosphere of terror throughout Germany were as useful in the service of his fear-instilling propaganda machinery as they were a part of his delusions. There is another important weapon the totalitarians use in their campaign to frighten the world into submission. This is the weapon of psychological shock. Hitler kept his enemies in a state of constant confusion and diplomatic upheaval. They never knew what this unpredictable madman was going to do next. Hitler was never logical because he knew that that was what he was expected to be. Logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and the monotonously repeated nonsense have more emotional appeal in a cold war than logic and reason. While the enemy is still searching for a reasonable counter-argument to the first lie, the totalitarians can assault him with another. Strategical mental shocks were the instruments the Nazis used when they entered the Rhineland in 1936 and when they concluded their non-aggression pact with Russia in 1939. Stalin used the same strategy at the time of the Korean invasion in 1950, which he directed, as did the Chinese and the North Koreans when they accused the United States of bacteriological warfare. By acting in this apparently irrational way, the totalitarians throw their logic-minded enemies into confusion. The enemy feels compelled to deny the propagandistic lies or to explain things as they really are, and these actions immediately put him in the weaker defensive position. For the galloping lie can never be overtaken, it can only be overthrown. The technique of psychological shock has still another effect. It may so confuse the mind of the individual citizen that he ceases to make his own evaluations and begins to lean passively on the opinions of others. Hitler's destruction of Warsaw and Rotterdam after the armistice in 1940, a complete violation of international law, immobilized France and shook the other democratic nations. Being in a paralysis of moral indignation, they became psychologically ill-equipped to deal with the Nazi horrors. Just as the technological advances of the modern world have refined and perfected the weapons of physical warfare, so the advance in man's understanding of the manipulation of public opinion have enabled him to refine and perfect the weapons of psychological warfare. The indoctrination barrage. The continual intrusion into our minds of the hammering noises of arguments and propaganda can lead to two kinds of reactions. It may lead to apathy and indifference, the I don't care reaction, or to a more intensified desire to study and to understand. Unfortunately, the first reaction is the more popular one. The flight from study and awareness is much too common in a world that throws too many confusing pictures to the individual. For the sake of our democracy based on freedom and individualism, we have to bring ourselves back to study again and again. Let me read that sentence one more time because it is very important. For the sake of our democracy based on freedom and individualism, we have to bring ourselves back to study again and again. Otherwise, we can become easy victims of a well-planned verbal attack on our minds and consciences. We cannot be enough aware of the continual coercion of our senses and minds, the continual suggestive attacks which may pass through the intellectual barriers of insight. Repetition and Pavlovian conditioning exhaust the individual and may seduce him ultimately to accept a truth he himself initially defied and scorned. The totalitarians are very ingenious in arousing latent guilt in us by repeating over and over again how criminally the Western world has acted toward innocent and peaceful people. The totalitarians may attack our identification with our leaders by ridiculing them, making use of every man's latent critical attitude toward all leaders. Sometimes they use a strategy of boredom to lull the people to sleep. They would like the entire Western world to fall into a hypnotic sleep under the illusion of peaceful coexistence. In a more refined strategy, they would like to have us cut all our ties of loyalty with the past away from relatives and parents. The more you have forsaken them and their so-called outmoded concepts, the better you will cooperate with those who want to take mental possession of you. Every political strategy that aims toward arousing fear and suspicion tends to isolate the insecure individual until he surrenders to those forces that seem to him stronger than his former friends. And last but not least, let us not forget that in the battle of arguments, those with the best and most forceful verbal strategy tend to win. The totalitarians organize intensive dialectical training for their subjects, lest their doubts get the better of them. They try to do the same thing to the rest of the world in a less obtrusive way. We have to learn to encounter the totalitarians' exhausting barrage of words with better training and better understanding. If we try to escape from these problems of mental defense or deny their complications, the Cold War will gradually be lost to the slow encroachment of words and more words. The enigma of coexistence. Is it possible to coexist with a totalitarian system that never ceases to use its psychological artillery? Can a free democracy be strong enough to tolerate the parasitic intrusion of totalitarianism into its rights and freedoms? History tells us that many opposing and clashing ideologies have been able to coexist under a common law that assured tolerance and justice. The church no longer burns its apostates. Before the opposites of totalitarianism and free democracy can coexist under the umbrella of supervising law and mutual goodwill, a great deal more of mutual understanding and tolerance will have to be built up. The actual Cold War and psychological warfare certainly do not help toward this end. To the totalitarian, the word coexistence has a different meaning than it has to us. The totalitarian may use it merely as a catchword or an appeaser. The danger is that the concept of peaceful coexistence may become a disguise, dulling the awareness of the inevitable interactions and so profiting the psychologically stronger party. Lenin spoke about the strategic breathing spell, paradishka, that has to weaken the enemy. Too enthusiastic a peace movement may mean a superficial appeasement of problems. Such appeal has to be studied and restudied. Let it result in a dangerous letdown of defenses which have to remain mobilized to face a ruthless enemy. Coexistence may mean a suffocating subordination, much like that of prisoners coexisting with their jailers. At its best, it may intimidate the intensive symbiotic or ever-parasitic relationship we can see among animals which need each other, or as we see it in the infant in its years of dependency upon its mother. To those living freely in a democracy, coexistence must imply freedom and mutuality. The totalitarian concept of unfreedom cannot mix with freedom. There are concepts and ideas that cannot coexist and that do not tolerate one another. In order to coexist and to cooperate, one must have notions and comparable images of integration, of a sameness of ideas, of a belonging together, of an interdependence of the whole human race in spite of the existence of racial and cultural differences. Otherwise, the ideology backed by the greater military strength will strangle the weaker one. Peaceful coexistence presupposes on both sides a high understanding of the problems and complications of simple coexistence, of mutual agreement and limitations of the diversity of personalities, and especially of the coexistence of contrasting and irreconcilable thoughts and feelings in every individual, of the innate ambivalence of man. It demands an understanding of the rights of both the individual and the collectivity. Using coexistence as a catchword, we may obscure the problems involved, and we may find that we use the word as a flag that covers gradual surrender to the stronger strategist. And that ends chapter 5. And I will see you in the next video, chapter 6. stay with me.